He wasn't a man who smiled easily, and that was all right because there wasn't much on the land that smiled back. Gideon Falk was 51 years old, and he had lived alone on the Hollow Creek property for going on 9 years. Not because he had to, because somewhere along the way, alone had become the thing he was best at. His boots knew the path from the barn to the kitchen before his eyes opened in the morning. His hands knew the rope, the post, the pump handle. He didn't need much. He didn't ask for much, and the land, dry and patient as it was, didn't ask anything of him either. That was the arrangement. He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't happy either. He was just present. The way a stone is present in a field, unmoved, accounted for. There. It was the last week of October when the wagon came down the Millhaven Road at a time of day when no wagon ought to be moving. The sky going that bruised purple before dark, the temperature dropping the way it does in the high plains, like someone shut a door on the warmth. Gideon had been mending the fence along the south pasture, and he straightened up when he heard the wheels, not because he was curious exactly, but because sound carried different out here, and anything that wasn't wind or cattle deserved a second thought. The wagon slowed near his gate. Then it stopped. The woman driving it was 26 years old, though Gideon wouldn't know that for another hour. What he saw first was the set of her jaw, tight, forward, the expression of someone trying very hard not to look like they were holding everything together with their back teeth. Her hair was dark and pinned badly, half of it fallen loose. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone that she hadn't tried to cover, which told him something. People who hide their bruises are still ashamed of them. People who don't, they've moved past shame into something harder and more useful. "Excuse me," she said. Gideon rested his forearms on the top fence rail. "I'm looking for the Dunfield property. Used to be called the Dunfield property. I was told it was 3 miles past the junction, but I've gone 3 miles and I don't see anything that looks like." "Dunfield's been gone 12 years, Gideon said. Place was sold, then sold again. Now it belongs to a man named Whitaker who doesn't live on it." She absorbed that. "The house still standing?" "Last I drove past." She looked down the road, then back at him. Her hands on the reins were steady, he noticed, steadier than her eyes. "Is there somewhere in this county," she said, "where a woman can stay the night that isn't going to cost her the last of what she's carrying?" Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He wasn't a man who made fast decisions. He'd learned over 51 years that fast decisions were usually just feelings wearing a disguise. But the bruise on her face was real. The temperature was real, and the dark was coming. "Step down," he said. "I'll put the horse in the barn." Her name was Sylvie Crane, and she was 26 years old, and she had been driving since before sunup. She told him this at the kitchen table while he put water on for coffee, and she told him without embellishment, the way a person tells something when they've already burned through the part of themselves that dramatizes. She had been living in Caldwell, 2 counties east, in a house that belonged to her late husband's brother. Her husband, a man named Frank Crane, had died 18 months ago of a fever that took him in 4 days. He'd been 39. They'd had no children. The property they'd worked together had gone to his family by the terms of a will she hadn't known existed until after the burial. "I kept working the land," Sylvie said. "For Edwin, that's the brother. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd see I was useful, that eventually he'd offer me some kind of arrangement. Something fair." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "He offered me an arrangement," she said. "It wasn't the kind I meant." Gideon didn't ask her to say more than that. He'd heard enough of the world to fill in those particular blanks. "So you left?" 2 days ago. He told me if I walked out, I wasn't getting a cent of what Frank had promised me verbally. I said that was fine." She paused. "It wasn't fine, but I said it anyway. There was a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. It wasn't quite, but it was close." Gideon poured himself coffee and sat across from her. He was a big man, Not tall, but solid in the way of men who have lifted heavy things their whole lives. His face had deep lines around the eyes and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been out on the land for a very long time. "How do you know about the Dunfield property?" he asked. Sylvie looked at the table. "My mother grew up near here. She used to talk about a family called the Dunfields who had a place with a good well and apple trees. I thought maybe. I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe there'd be something, somewhere to start." "Apple trees are still there," Gideon said. "But the well went dry years back." She nodded slowly. He watched her, this 26-year-old woman sitting in his kitchen with a bruise on her face and a wagon outside with everything she owned in it, and he thought, this is a person who has been let down so many times they've started to expect it. You can see it in the way they hold themselves. Not collapsed. These ones never collapse, they're too stubborn for that, but braced, like they're always waiting for the next thing to fall. "You can sleep in the back room tonight," he said. "It's not much, but the stove reaches it and the roof doesn't leak." Sylvie looked up at him. "I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to." She was quiet for a moment. I want you to understand that I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for my keep. I can cook, I can mend, I can drive fence posts, and I'm not slow about it. I just need." She stopped. Something moved across her face, something that wasn't quite composure. "I just need one night where nothing goes wrong." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "Then let's try for that," he said. She stayed 3 days, not because Gideon asked her to, but because on the second morning she came out at dawn and started mending the fence line he'd left unfinished, and she did it correctly, which surprised him. And when he came out with coffee and told her she didn't have to do that, she just looked at him and said, "I know." And on the third morning the weather turned ugly, and it would have been foolish to put a horse on that road. They moved around each other carefully, the way two people do when they are both accustomed to having space and are trying not to take up too much of each other's. Gideon noticed things. The way she ate everything on her plate without comment, the way people do when they are genuinely hungry and not performing appetite. The way she talked to the horse, not baby talk, but real talk, like a colleague. The way she'd sometimes stop in the middle of a task and just stand very still, like she was listening for something. He didn't ask about Edwin Crane. She didn't offer. On the third evening, while the wind threw itself against the windows, she sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and he found her writing. "What's that?" he asked, not intrusively. "Just the way you speak in a house when the weather's loud. List of towns within 50 miles that might need a seamstress or a cook," she said. "I'm good with both. Better with the needle, but I can do either." He looked at the list. She'd written 8 towns in a careful hand. "Morel doesn't have much work," he said. "Fentress might. There's a hotel been there since spring." He leaned over and tapped the paper. "And you forgot Aldine." She wrote it down. He straightened up and started toward the stove, and then he stopped. He was 51 years old, and he had not said anything he didn't mean in at least a decade. So what he said next, he meant. "I need someone to help with the books," he said, not looking at her. "The ranch runs well enough, but I've never had the head for numbers, and I've been overpaying the feed supplier for 2 years because I can't catch where the accounting goes sideways. I pay fair. Not grand, but fair. And the back room is yours as long as you want it." Silence. "That's a real offer," he said, "not an arrangement." He turned around then, because he wanted her to see his face when he said it, so she'd know the difference. Sylvie Crane, 26 years old, looked at him across the kitchen of Hollow Creek, with the wind pressing at the windows and the lamp making everything amber and close, and she said, "Can I think on it until morning?" "That's what mornings are for," Gideon said. She said yes, and for a while, for a good long while, it was just that. A fair arrangement, like he'd said. She worked the books and found the error with the feed supplier inside a week. It was a simple transposition, a 6 where a 9 ought to be, repeated 12 months running. She cooked on the nights she felt like it, and on the nights she didn't, they each fended for themselves without incident. She rode the fence line with him on good weather days. She learned the names of the cattle, not what Gideon called them, which was mostly nothing, but her own names for them, which she applied quietly and which he pretended not to notice. November passed. December came in cold and stayed. He was 51. She was 26. He knew the arithmetic, and he knew how it looked, and he did not let himself think about anything beyond the arrangement they had, because the arrangement was good and real, and the other thing, whatever the other thing might be, was just winter talking. Men got foolish in winter. He'd seen it. He was not going to be another one. But then, it was a Saturday in early January, and Sylvie had driven the wagon into Fentress for supplies, and she was supposed to be back by mid-afternoon, and she wasn't. By 4 o'clock, Gideon was watching the road. By 5, he'd saddled the horse. He found her 3 miles out. On the Fentress road, the wagon stopped at an angle that meant something had gone wrong with the left rear wheel. She was standing beside it in the cold, and standing beside her, standing too close, the way a man stands when he's claiming space that isn't his, was Edwin Crane. Gideon recognized him from nothing. He'd never met the man, but he recognized the posture. He'd seen that posture on men before. The lean, the proximity, the way the body is a kind of sentence that says, "You belong to me." Sylvie's face was turned away. Her arms were crossed over her chest. She was 26 years old, and she was standing in the cold, and she had already said no. Gideon could tell, the way you can tell when the conversation has already happened and you're arriving at the aftermath, and Edwin Crane was still talking. Gideon brought the horse up slow. Edwin looked up. Sylvie looked up. On Edwin's face, the sizing up of a man who is deciding how much trouble this new presence will cost him. On Sylvie's face, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite shame, but was somewhere between them, in the territory that belongs to people who hate needing to be helped. "They're a problem?" Gideon said. He wasn't loud. He was never loud. But the way he said it, you understood that the question was a formality. Edwin put on a smile that was made mostly of insinuation. "Just talking to my sister-in-law. Family matter." "She's not your family," Gideon said. "She's my wife. Now, I need to stop here for just a moment, because I know some of you watching right now might be thinking, wait, did he just say that? And yes, friends, he did. That's the kind of man Gideon Falk was. Not a man of many words, but the words he chose, they landed. Before I go on, I want to ask, where are you watching from tonight? Are you in Texas? Tennessee? Maybe somewhere up in Montana or out in the Pacific Northwest? Leave it in the comments below, because I love knowing who's riding along with these stories. And if this one's speaking to you, a like means more than you know. It's what keeps this little channel going. Now, back to that road. Edwin Crane, 44 years old and accustomed to getting what he wanted from people who had less leverage than him, went very still. "Your wife," he repeated. "That's what I said." Edwin looked at Sylvie. She had not moved. Her expression was something Gideon couldn't entirely read from the angle he was at. But she hadn't corrected him, and in this moment, that was enough. She never mentioned. "She doesn't owe you explanations," Gideon said. He swung down from the horse, slow and easy, and walked to the wagon to look at the wheel. It had come off the hub on one side. Fixable. 10 minutes with the right tool, he'd brought them, because he was the kind of man who thought ahead when someone he cared about was late. He crouched by the wheel and started working. Edwin stood there for another full minute. Gideon did not look up at him. Sylvie did not look at him. And a man can only stand in silence being ignored for so long before he understands that the conversation is over. They heard his horse on the road a minute later, going back the way he'd come. Gideon fixed the wheel. He did not say anything. When it was done, he stood up and put the tools away, and Sylvie was standing a few feet off, watching him. "You didn't have to say that," she said. "I know. He'll tell people. Let him." She was quiet for a long moment. The sun had dropped behind the hills, and the road was going gray and cold, and she was 26 years old, standing out here with a man she'd known for less than 3 months, who had just told a stranger she was his wife without asking her first. "Why?" she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question. Gideon looked at the road where Edwin had been, then back at her. "Because it was the fastest way to make him leave," he said. "And because—" He stopped. He was 51 years old, and he was very bad at this particular kind of sentence. "Because I didn't want you standing out here in the cold answering questions you shouldn't have to answer. That's all." Sylvie looked at him for a long moment. "That's all," she said, like she was trying it out. "That's all," he said. She nodded once. Then she climbed back up onto the wagon. "I got flour," she said, "and coffee. And one of those women at the Fentress General Store gave me a jar of put-up peaches because she said I had kind eyes." "You do," Gideon said before he could stop himself. He heard her very carefully not respond to that. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark at 51 years old, and he was honest with himself in the way that nighttime requires if you're the kind of person who takes honesty seriously. He thought, "You have made this more complicated than you said you would," he thought. "She is 26, and she has already been through more than most people survive with their dignity intact, and the last thing she needs is a 51-year-old man who smells like cattle making her feel obligated to something she didn't sign up for." He thought, but she stayed. She could have left any morning since November. She had money now, what he'd paid her. Not grand, but fair. She had contacts in Fentress, in Aldine. She had options that she hadn't had when she drove down the Millhaven Road in the dark with a bruise on her face and everything she owned in a wagon. She stayed. He didn't let that mean more than it meant. But he didn't make it mean less, either. In the morning, she was already up when he came to the kitchen, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she was standing at the window with her coffee, looking out at the barn, and when he came in, she turned around and looked at him directly. Not at the stove, not at the floor, but at him, and said, "If you ever meant any of that, what you said on the road, I want you to know that I wouldn't say no." Gideon stood very still. "I'm 26, she said. "I know how that sounds, next to 51. I know what people will say. I don't care what people say. I spent 18 months caring what people said while I worked a dead man's land for a man who wanted to use me, and where did that get me?" She took a breath. "I know you. I know how you work. I know you're the kind of man who packs the right tools before you ride out to find someone who's late, because that's just what you do. I know you talk to the cattle like they're people, and you think I don't notice, but I notice everything." A pause. "I know you haven't been easy on yourself about the age thing. I know because I've seen you stop yourself about 6 times. He stared at her. "I'm saying," she said quietly, "that you don't have to stop yourself." The kitchen was warm. Outside, the January sky was doing something soft and gray that might become snow. The jar of put-up peaches was on the counter where she'd left it the night before, and later he would think about how that small domestic detail, the peaches, the jar, the counter, was somehow the most vivid thing about the morning. The way specific ordinary things become permanent when everything around them changes. Gideon Falk, 51 years old, set down his coffee. He crossed the kitchen. He was not a man of gestures, but he took her hand, this woman who was 26 and who had driven through the dark and said yes to fare and mended his fence and named his cattle and had kind eyes. And he held it, just that, just her hand in both of his, and he said, "I meant it." She looked at their hands. Then she looked up at him. "Okay," she said. "Then we're all right." They were married in April, in the Fentress County Clerk's office, with the clerk's secretary as witness, because she happened to be walking past, and Sylvie grabbed her arm and said, "Do you have 5 minutes and a good heart?" The secretary said she had both, And they did, and she wept a little, which neither Gideon nor Sylvie had expected, but which felt appropriate. Sylvie Falk was 26 years old on the day she signed her name in that small office. And Gideon Falk was 51. And nobody who mattered said a word about it. Edwin Crane did, apparently, say several words about it in Caldwell, but none of those words made it as far as Hollow Creek, and so they didn't count. Gideon fixed the well that spring. It took 2 weeks and help from a man named Gus down the road who owed him a favor, and when the first water came up clean and cold, Sylvie stood there and put her hand in it and said, "There it is," like she was greeting something she'd been expecting. The apple trees bloomed that May. There were 6 of them, along the fence line of the south pasture. The ones from the old Dunfield story her mother had told her. The ones that had drawn her down this road in the dark in October, when she had nothing left but direction. They bloomed pink and white, and the smell of them carried all the way to the porch, on a good breeze. She stood out there one evening and looked at them, and he stood beside her, 51 years old to her 26, and he didn't say anything, because there are some moments that are better than anything you could say about them. She leaned against his arm. He didn't move. That was all. That was everything. There are people in this world who will pass a woman standing in the cold and keep riding. It is easier to keep riding. Easier to tell yourself it isn't your trouble, isn't your road, isn't your problem to solve. And those people aren't monsters. Sometimes they're just tired. Sometimes they don't know what to do. Sometimes they've been burned before by the getting involved. But then there are the ones who stop, not because they have to, not because they're heroes in some story they're telling about themselves later. Just because a person is standing in the cold and something in them cannot, in good conscience, keep riding. Gideon Falk stopped. He wasn't looking for anything when he did it. He wasn't calculating. He was just a 51-year-old man who looked at a 26-year-old woman with a bruise on her face and a steady hand on the reins and thought, she deserves one night where nothing goes wrong. He thought he was offering one night. She turned it into a life. That's the thing about kindness given without conditions. You can't control where it goes. You can't fence it in or set terms on it. You put it out there, honest and plain, and sometimes it just grows. Like apple trees along a fence line, like water coming up clear from a well you thought was dry. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about the things we think are gone that aren't, about the people we find on roads we almost didn't take, about the 51-year-old men who stop when everyone else keeps moving, and the 26-year-old women who are strong enough to say, I wouldn't say no, who are brave enough to put words to the thing instead of waiting for someone else to say it first. That takes something. That takes real courage. The quiet kind. The kind nobody writes songs about. To everyone listening tonight, thank you. Truly, this channel, these stories, all of it, it's only possible because you show up. So wherever you're watching from, I hope tonight finds you warm. I hope someone in your life knows how to pack the right tools before they ride out to find you. And as always, friends, keep riding. The road is longer than you think, and better too.